Germany's destruction because of not just the Green New Deal, but the mass migration, invasion of Germany. And all you have to do is look at Germany's cities now, the places where they're ensconced these vast numbers of people, the enormous cost to the German taxpayer, the dramatic rise in criminality, little boys being raped and murdered, and so forth. And these things are not even allowed to be reported in the press anymore. She deserves the lion's share of credit for pushing that. And again, she's another co-conspirator with von der Leyen. Von der Leyen was the, defense minister, and she was a disaster. She was the one that was insisting that armored fighting vehicles be developed and built to accommodate pregnant women in uniform going into battle. I mean, I can't conceive of anything dumber and more stupid than that. But that was von der Leyen, and that was blessed by miracle. And von der Leyen is now running the European Union. Now, what he's describing. Failure. It's denial. Germany tried to build a moral fantasy, and when reality pushed back, they silenced the evidence instead of fixing the problem. And that's when societies break. Because once leaders ignore public safety to protect ideology, people lose trust. And trust is the one thing a government can't survive without. I don't think she's going to last much longer, because I think everybody's had it up to here, with the European Union. Here's what needs to be understood before everything ends well. Let's put it this way. This war in Ukraine is lost, and that's going to become patently obvious. And the Russians are going to be victorious. They're going to dictate the terms under which the map is redrawn, and new actors emerge. But there's something even more important than what happens in Ukraine. And I predict that Germany will walk out of NATO and walk out of the EU, because it's the only way. Power of the EU and NATO. Remember, many of your guests have said this, and people always chuckle over. I always thought it was deeply offensive and thought it was dead wrong. But this was the attitude in Great Britain and France and the United States. And that is NATO exists to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. That last point exposes the real fracture. For decades, Germany played along in a system designed to limit its power, not strengthen it. Now, the bill has come due. When a war is clearly lost and alliances stop serving national survival, countries don't stay out of loyalty. They leave out of necessity. And if Berlin decides its future depends on walking away from Brussels and NATO, the entire post-Cold War order cracks overnight. Well, the Germans are finally emerging from this state of Stockholm Syndrome that they've been living in for decades, where the German walk were bad. And how much money do you want? That's over. The Germans have had it with that. The new generation that's coming up is sick of it. The alternative for Germany is sick of it. And this Atlantic alliance has not produced security for Germany. It's dragged Germany into a confrontation with Russia that most Germans want nothing to do with. So Germany is going to march out of the EU. It's going to march out of NATO. When that happens, that's the end of NATO and the EU, because the only way they can exist is with Germany as the linchpin, as the keystone and the edifice. Once the Germans say enough and walk, it's over. And that's where we're headed. This is the breaking point he's describing. Germany finally shaking off decades of inherited guilt politics. Once a nation stops apologizing for its own existence, it stops accepting limits imposed by others. And if Germany walks, their keystone nation decides it's done being restrained. So this entire war in Ukraine that was launched to destroy Russia and was always linked to the idea, and this goes back to the White House in 2020 when I was in there, and I wrote a paper on it, and it was given to the president, and he just, I don't think he could even imagine it. But it was an argument against disrupting relations with Germany because of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I tried to outline the hundreds of years of very profitable and productive relations between Russia and the German-speaking peoples, based on an exchange of commodities, commercial relationships, and the elites actually got along very well. If you go back over the last 300 or 400 years of history in involving Germany and Russia, the two world wars are anomalies. They should never have happened, and they did happen. It's tragic that they did, but I think we'll leave the Atlantic Alliance and it will leave the EU for these very reasons. What he's pointing out is simple. Germany and Russia were natural partners for centuries. The wars were the exception. So trying to force a permanent break between them was never sustainable. And now Germany is beginning to choose history over pressure. And that shift will rewrite Europe and all the neocons that have done everything they possibly could to promote death and destruction and war in Eastern Europe and across the continent. These are the same people who have pushed these migrations, heavily funded by people like Soros and others who couldn't wait to shove millions and millions of people into Europe who are not Europeans, will never be Europeans, cannot become Europeans, and don't want to be Europeans. They are all going to stand around and then begin to say, "See, the Germans are evil. They're back at it again. They're evil because they're charting their own on their own future." It's a lot of nonsense. There's no Nazi revival there. Nor will there ever be one, in my judgment. But what you see out in eastern Ukraine, for some reason, these same neocons are happy to see these Ukrainian soldiers sport SS emblems forth in their war with Russia, which makes no sense at all. None. What he's calling out is the double standard. The moment Germany chooses its own future, critics rush to paint it as dangerous, while ignoring the extremists they quietly support elsewhere. It's not about Nazism returning. It's about Germany refusing to be controlled. And that's what really scares the people who built this system. That is something that didn't get much. It did get a little bit of press, but the significance didn't seem to be lost on people. I guess because they're like, no, I can't acknowledge that. Because then, that would mean we can't support Zelensky. Because he seems okay with one person that's not okay with it. And going back to that interview with Viktor Orban, he was also asked specifically about what chances the Ukraine army, with SS or not, what chance do they have? European politics intellectually is very sophisticated, but what they are saying basically means that they would not like to have a peace just now. They would like to continue the war. They think and they speak about it publicly that we have to continue the war to support Ukraine more. The situation will improve on the front line, and we will have a better circumstances or preconditions for negotiation. Wrong, totally wrong not to speak about geopolitics and human dimension economically and financially is just crazy. We finance a country which has no chance to win the war, but at the same time, there's a high level of corruption. Yeah, now, obviously that issue with corruption has exploded since he made those comments. You mentioned at the outset, one of Zelensky's right has been caught and is now somewhere in hiding. And it's still he's in Israel along with another one. They both fled to Israel. They will be safe there. For now. But if Zelensky falls, it's unclear how long they're going to protect him. Oh, listen, I think they're going to be safe. Remember the gentleman who was a pedophile who was caught out in Las Vegas? I can't remember his name now. But it turns out, he was an Israeli citizen, and he was flown immediately to Israel, where he has stayed and is safe, and will never be extradited. No, I think the Jewish state will remain a haven for Jews, regardless of what they do anywhere else in the world. And that's certainly true for the two gentlemen whose names, one I think is Mind or something. Yeah, Mind, yeah. And the other one, I can't remember his name. But, at some point, Zelensky will probably pack it in and go there as well. What this whole is the selective outrage. The same voices that attack Germany for choosing its own path ignore the uncomfortable realities inside Ukraine. Corruption, extremist symbols, and political chaos. And when leaders pretend not to see it, just to keep the war narrative alive, it shows you this isn't about principles anymore. It's about protecting agendas. And once the truth starts leaking out, even slowly, public support collapses fast. Well, yeah, because I was going to say, and I'm talking to some folks who are on the ground in Kiev or have access there, and they're saying he is literally at risk. This could knock him out when nothing else do. So apparently, he's not as safe as many in the West may think, even with all these announcements. Well, a lot of people have waited for him to be subjected to the Mussolini treatment. That may yet come. Who knows? He is distant from his own population. What no one here in the West is told, and you can only hear this from people who are on the ground over there, or Poland, or in Russia. There are some Germans that will tell you this. I think one of them is named Baba. This is a German journalist. I listened to him and he said the same thing. The population has turned decisively against this war with Russia. They know this has to end before there's anything left. That's where they're headed right now. And the other thing is that Ukrainians living in the western part of Ukraine are also coming around to understanding that whether we like it or not, that government that emerges after this war in Kyiv must be friendly to Russia. If it isn't, the Russians will march all the way to where we are, right up to the border with Poland, if necessary, to secure their country. We have never recognized Russia's legitimate national security interests in Poland or, in Ukraine. Never done it. And we don't seem to understand, as a result, we more than anybody else are responsible for this bloodletting. You know, if there was a humanitarian bone in Donald Trump's body on the basis of what's happened thus far, he would lower the boom and say, "Mr. Zelensky, you're finished. You're out." However, I suspect that the same billionaires that are calling the shots in Washington in terms of policy towards the Middle East and towards Iran are also calling the shots in Ukraine. And these billionaires have decided that they want Zelensky there, and they want to continue doing whatever they can to harm Russia. That's their agenda. That's not an American agenda. Yeah, that's what the billionaires want. And I think more and more people are coming around understanding the billionaires really are in charge. You know, they own the House, they own the Senate, they own the White House. The key point here isn't the drama around individual leaders. It's the shift happening on the ground. Public support inside Ukraine is collapsing, and that changes everything. When a population no longer believes in a war, the political structure built on that war starts to crumble. And the deeper truth he's highlighting is this: ignoring Russia's security concerns didn't make the conflict disappear. It guaranteed escalation. And now the consequences are landing, and people across the region are realizing this has to end before it destroys what's left.